Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Hallett. I'm the Director of Studies at the Paul Mellon Centre, and I'd like to welcome you to the fourth of this year's series of Paul Mellon lectures, which have been given by Professor Tom Crow of the Institute for Fine Arts in New York. Now, as many of you know, and of course many of you have been experiencing, Tom has been taking us on a magical mystery tour of modernist London and of modernist British art. A tour that began in the late 1950s that has taken us into clothes shops and television studios and art colleges, and it has traversed film, photography, graphic design, and painting. It's a tour that has asked us to look seriously at the covers of jazz albums, at the collage walls of painters' studios, and at the adverts found on the pages of student magazines. And it's a tour that has at the same time given us fresh, sometimes surprising, and always enthralling perspectives on the work of artists such as David Hockney and Robyn Denny, Bridget Riley, and Pauline Boty. And in fact, in so many ways, this strikes me as what we've been watching over the last few weeks is a really interesting lateral form of art history, in which we're interested in the cognate relationships, the correspondences, the substitutions that operate across a culture at a given time, as much as the onward path of a linear chronology. And over again, Tom, you've made us think anew about the correspondences between different cultural forms, visual and otherwise, and about the ways they may have helped shape each other's meanings and associations. And tonight we move into yet another terrain, another new terrain, into the counterculture that emerged in the late 1960s, and that, as Professor Crow will now go on to demonstrate, once again found full, florid expression in an astonishing variety of materials, from posters, pop songs and shop fronts to the most advanced and innovative modes of sculpture. So a treat lies in store. But before we turn to Tom himself and we listened to his thoughts on these very, very different kinds of art form, I do want to make an unashamed plug for the book to which, of course, this lecture series offers such a close correspondence. The great book, The Long March of Pop, published by Yale University Press, and that's available, as I've just been told, in a National Gallery bookshop at opening hours, but also I think a number of you have been given a flyer for the book, and I can say this quite sincerely, this has been one of the most exciting and ambitious and sophisticated readings of modern art that I've read for many, many years. I'm sure many of you already read it. For those of you who haven't, again, you've got another great treat in store if you pick up this book and read it. But for now, let's turn to tonight's lecture. Can I ask you to give a very, very warm welcome to Tom Crow?
Well, thank you very much again, Mark, for such a warm introduction and such a heartening of understanding of what I'm trying to accomplish, and the most optimistic summary of what that could be. And the book certainly thanks you too. The music always takes us somewhere. We haven't been in the previous lectures, and here we were sampling British musicians and bands covering Bob Dylan, which was a kind of hallmark of identification with the international counterculture at that moment when the basement tapes were circulating as demos and being covered by seemed just about everyone at the time. And I promised at the end of last week's lecture a voyage into the counterculture, as Mark promised, a place where the imagery of Pauline Boty and the mind manipulations of Bridget Riley crossed over. And that will be the goal this evening. But there will firstly be another, if less obvious, point of departure. One into the same broad topic of artists and hippies, but one that arises, strangely enough, from that second wave of modernism imported into London during the early 1960s, discussed in the second lecture, namely the American artistic theory and critical vocabulary of Clement Greenberg. So just how would that have happened? The great critic was observed in Lecture 2 on a visit to London, inspecting an installation of paintings by his countryman Kenneth Noland at the Casman Gallery. At this juncture of the early 1960s, our earlier concern was the pressure experienced by David Hockney at his patron Casman's embrace of large-scale American abstraction as a new aesthetic standard. And noted in passing was the fact that Greenberg's airfare to London had been provided by a group of young London sculptors. So eager were they for his judgments and advice. So this is the moment to take that thread further. Just saying, maybe it'll stay there and still pick up. This is the moment to take that thread further and move from painting to sculpture. The sculptors in question were the students and colleagues grouped around the teaching and example of Anthony Caro, a cohort subsequently renowned as the New Generation in capital letters. Caro's visits to the States, conversing with Noland and Greenberg, and then doing the same at home with Greenberg's young Harvard acolyte Michael Fried, who was in the UK on a Rhodes Scholarship. All that had infused Caro's practice and thinking with a coherence and force that was rare in British practice. The setting for all this was the St. Martin's School of Art, just a few hundred meters away from where we're sitting right now. As a condition of his teaching there, Caro had secured freedom from the state requirements for the advanced diploma in design, and thereby enabled for himself a seminar-like concentration on what he and the group regarded as the fundamental issues in the nature of sculpture. So in such an atmosphere of self-serious concentration, there was little room for a Soho-style dress code, nor did Greenberg's contempt for any form of widely popular expression, which was all kitsch in his parlance, permit an embrace of music or style which would comprise the first wave jazz modernists who had just emerged a few streets away during the early 1950s. Bruce McLean, who joined the St. Martin's sculpture course as a young recruit in 1963, described the conduct of the Caro Circle with a well-known quip, as he put it. Quote, "The St. Martin's Sculpture Forum would avoid every broader issue, discussing for hours the position of one piece of metal in relation to another. 12 adult men with pipes would walk for hours around sculpture and mumble." That is something of a caricature, as McLean himself later admitted, but surely accurate as stylistic description. The pipes harking back to the slightly seedy aspect of the 1950s traditional jazz purists, the Bunk Johnson aficionados, in opposition to whom the sharply dressed first-wave modernists had defined themselves. Now, you've been looking at a photograph of McLean at age 20, a year after his arrival in London from Glasgow, standing in front of one of his student efforts, mocked up in timber pieces. Judging by his haircut and the layered, if slightly messy, outfit, it would be fair to view McLean as at least responding to the younger mod ethos of that moment in 1964. The lost piece of sculpture behind him offers a learner's lens onto the characteristic artistic outcomes that were being encouraged at St. Martin's at the time. If Herbert Reed had laid down the law, consistent with the example of Henry Moore, that sculpture was an inherently monumental medium, quote, that should be, by definition, be imposing, enduring, and therefore compact, end quote, then McLean's Juvenilia flouts all three requirements. It's provisional both in conception and in execution. The spindly built-in pedestal apes the instability of an upended pendulum, signaled by the implied rolling movement of the small circular element on the curving shelf. So a disc taking the place of a ball, like all the surrounding forms, reducing a projecting volume into a layering of flattened planes. As a consequence, all the variety formerly provided by volumetric shape migrates to the inflected edges of the work's constituent planes. And it comes as no surprise that the works of McLean's teachers and older fellow students at St. Martin's display similar traits. To instance, one of the most famous period examples, Philip King's fiberglass composite Genghis Khan from '63, stages a drama between volume and flattened planes as its rococo silhouettes escape the large basal cone at the top while curving horizontal counterparts lap out from beneath the base, as if revealing an earlier state of flux when molten matter seeped out and congealed itself into an animated impression denied to the core. The fact that the title of the sculpture, Genghis Khan, means roughly the same thing as the surname of the maker, King, reinforces the implied regality of its deep purple hue. Yet the splitting form from which the tongues of matter emerge transforms the cone shape from a monumental solid, as one might first apprehend it, into a parted robe or a split carapace, perhaps an organic petal form recalling King's rosebud from the year before. Nearly all these formal and technical choices can be understood to follow from American modernist precepts. Precepts intended to liberate the sculptural object from ponderous monumentality carved in marble or cast in bronze. The frankly synthetic colors and materials, along with this migration of complicated incident to the planar contours, all would have followed from the imperative to make sculpture as free as possible from dependence on the inherited conventions of the medium, to make it as abstract as possible. The 1964 Anabasis by William Tucker, who was the main theorist and art historian among the St. Martin's group, stages a clear-cut evolutionary drama out of these modernist moves. Three elements of the work, as you can plainly see, share an identically symmetrical profile. The white synthetic material of the lower two emulates the bleached stone of the Greek world, evoked in Tucker's title from Herodotus already. And the bottom of these elements, with its squared off corners, is like architecture. The middle one is smoothly rounded, like sculpture. But the surmounting piece projects the lower two into the contemporary, rendering the lobed profile as a cutout silhouette from a flat sheet of transparent yellow perspex, fastened to its neighbor with a plain pair of clips and fasteners. There, as you can see in that detail. Their frank visibility a response to those undisguised rivets and bolts that held Caro's sculptures together. Such an object, in Tucker's understanding, is less a visual statement than a conditional proposition, an invitation, in his words, to suppose such a thing should exist. That conditional syntax implies the regular give and take of informed discussion, testing the propositional cogency of each work, fine-tuning its syntax in the way that the impatient young McLean tuned out as interminable mumbling. But the self-estimation of Tucker as to the rigor and importance of St. Martin's sculpture commanded general assent. The New Generation exhibition at the Whitechapel in 1965 presented the group in its own chosen terms. And Greenberg followed in 1968 with the approbation, quote, "I think certain Englishmen are doing the best sculpture in the world today." Then harking back to his visit to London back in '63, he said, "I began to think of it as a possibility in the fall of 1963 that it may be up to the milieu formed by the new English sculptors to save the avant-garde," end of quote. Well, that was kind of heady international endorsement of the results of the discursive St. Martin's sculpture project. And as late as 1969, Charles Harrison, the young critic, curator, and editor, approvingly credited the group with a Greenbergian, quote, "desire to make constructed sculptures in which the sum of the parts shall be a discrete experience perceptible only in visual and physical terms," end quote. Not breezy rhetoric, but a hallmark of the concentrated seriousness with which this enterprise in achieving thoroughgoing autonomy and self-sufficiency was taken. But by the time that Harrison wrote these words, they carried a kind of elegiac tone, as he acknowledged that this propositional mode of sculpture had moved away from the center stage of current art. He explained the decline by the specialized settings and conditions of viewing that this sculpture required to make any kind of sense, outside of which all of its propositional rigor would disintegrate amid unsympathetic and competing stimuli. And Harrison also speculated that the rigor and authority of American modernist ideas, which had seemed so forceful in the early 1960s on their initial arrival in London, had been challenged to the point of exhaustion on their home ground and were therefore no longer able to provide much of a stimulus on British soil. And I think both of these diagnoses were insightful, but suffer from the same restriction to a strictly fine art context that he said had undermined the New Generation synthesis itself. Harrison comes close to seeing beyond that boundary when he calls in the same text the works of Scott and King brightly artificial confections. Brightly artificial confections, which had seen off pompous organic metaphors as resources for serious sculpture. The New Generation's paint box colors and plasticky surfaces, florid contours, all had followed from working through a modernist aversion to conventionally sculptural materials and picturesque surfaces, on the way to achieving what Greenberg called radical unlikeness to nature. But the end result, despite this edifying genealogy, was to make sculptures that could look like oversized baubles and toys. Titles like Scott's Pink Wheels or King's Tra-La-La display great confidence that the overriding seriousness of the enterprise behind the work will come through the impression of ironical playfulness. To viewers uninitiated into modernist protocols, it would have been, however, difficult to see such objects as more than amusing exercises in fanciful whimsy. Enter Neville Wallace of The Spectator in a cruelly trivializing review of the 1965 Whitechapel show that had gathered these artists under the New Generation rubric. He opined, the impression is of some gigantic artist's nursery cleaned up for the occasion, or open day in the school art department. Something, too, of a walk through heels, or a well-set-out trade fair of glossy consumer goods. End of quote. Not a fair judgment, but one that represented a clearly overlooked danger the sculptors had been courting. The year afterward, 2 lost pieces by McLean owned up to the problem in a way that his teachers could not. Raspberry Ripple was an impressive piece of carpentry in plywood, which no longer exists, linking the St. Martin's ethos to a literal confection and to a child's appetite for the oversweetened and the artificially colored. Its use as a module in Big Rock Candy Mountain, likewise lost, this explodes sculptural compactness under the likewise confectionery rubric of the singing hobo's dream of heaven that comes from the folk song title. 1966 was the year of Pauline Boty's death, and there's a way in which McLean recognized in the vocabulary of New Generation sculpture a convergence with the fairground palette and carnival enticements that had been subsumed into her brand of London pop. He was anticipating, though he probably would not have perceived it at the moment, the coming convergence of both New Generation and British pop with the favored visual vocabulary of the emergent international counterculture. Now, the term counterculture is a loaded one, to say the least, with an unruly number of not always compatible components. David Annesley was one St. Martin's artist who perceived in the counterculture the absolute antithesis of their rigorous group project. This came up when he was sort of mulling over the use of the word assemblage as a name for Caro's part-by-part method of composition, which Annesley instantly rejected, saying, if you use a word like assemblage, everyone immediately thinks of freaky West Coast shit, so it has bad connotations. Now, one supposes that Annesley was thinking of Ed Keenholz or Bruce Conner or maybe even George Herms, though he had probably seen little or none of this work in person. But one takes the point that Beat Generation style found object accretions were off limits where New Generation propositional objects were concerned. The trouble was that the freaky West Coast, whether shit or not, had been arriving in London in forms that ought to have given pause to the author of anything like his 1964 Swing Low. Annesley's undulating strip of party-colored metal surrounding one bright yellow perspectival window while lifting up another might be seen to have achieved radical non-objectivity. But there were other things that it looked like. For one, the graphic devices of the Art Nouveau revival that was radiating across the world from the San Francisco hippie ballroom posters. Here, I think, an apposite example by Wes Wilson heralding a triple bill of Chicago bluesman Aldous Rush with the Grateful Dead and Canned Heat up from L.A. Londoner Alan Aldridge, the proto-hippie entrepreneur who managed a day job as chief designer for Penguin Paperbacks at the time, composed his 1966 sleeve for the Who's Quick One around undulating, high-sheen silhouettes with more than a passing resemblance to the kind of outlines and finishes favored by Annesley and his cohort. Now, these resemblances might seem spurious, no more than morphological convergence between two drastically different genealogies, which is true enough. But appearance in such cases can trump logic. And there could have been little doubt as to which of the two genealogies was the more formidable and the one gaining in strength. Take the flat component shapes of the Jean Harlow mural on the changing face of the Kings Road boutique Granny Takes a Trip, and then imagine them projected into 3 dimensions. The outcome wouldn't have been far from the effect of sculptures like Annesley's 1965 Orinoco. One partner in the Granny's Boutique, Nigel Weymouth, had joined with Michael English in a cognate venture, a graphic design partnership they called Hapshash and the Colored Coat. They would have been the authors of the wall mural. And this 1967 design by English for an appearance by Soft Machine at the UFO Club could be likened all too readily to one of Annesley's rippling strips, flattened into 2 dimensions. Thus, the second wave of modernism imported into London, which is to say American fine art modernism, may well have begun to fade of its own accord by this date. But the hippie style in graphics and fashion made its situation worse. Against the countercultural repertoire of bright ribbons, clouds, and rainbows, the fragile discoveries of the new generation sculptors struggled either to stand out or to maintain their self-defining air of seriousness. Now, in this, their situation was cognate, if not exactly parallel, to the almost instant appropriation of Bridget Riley's hard-won patterns into fashion, as here in a Rudy Gernreich dress modeled by art world favorite Peggy Moffat in 1964. For the new generation, cognate resemblances, while uncanny, were inadvertent, but perhaps even more discouraging for that, in that the sculptors hadn't yet gained the world stage that Riley enjoyed and thus lacked the means to reassert themselves. Adding insult to injury, Victorian and Edwardian revivals took forms analogous to theirs in the exact opposite direction of the new. In San Francisco, ornate filigree and antiquated styles of lettering called to mind the ornaments of favored Victorian neighborhoods like the Haight-Ashbury, while resonating with the hippies' anti-technological atavism and the billowing extravagance of their thrift store and hippie trail fashions. The same equation took hold in London, as with Weymouth's own deft pastiche of fairy tale Art Nouveau. This likewise a poster for the UFO Club, with a cryptic symmetry drawn between UFO and CIA in the scrolling at the base of the design. Now, all of this, I should say parenthetically, is very fortunately available for direct apprehension at the V&A. And all these slides were chosen before I saw the show, but they're almost all in there. Now, Britain, unsurprisingly, contributed a more imperial flavor to the retro fashion than was the case in California. I was Lord Kitchener's valet in the Portobello Road, joined with grannies in promoting the fashion for repurposed military regalia. Jimi Hendrix provided this trend with its most charismatic devotee, while Brian Jones here, I think, tries just a little too hard on the elves and magic end of the spectrum. And the whole antiquity of this repertoire, or atavism of it, received its decisive seal of approval from no less an authority than the Beatles. Pete Townsend's cycle of music hall tunes that tell the story in a quick one while he's away laid the ground for The Who's unreachable rivals to craft an entire album of interwoven songs, conveyed by a recreation of themselves as yet another band of their own mock Edwardian invention. That venture required commensurable attention to the visual as much as to the oral presentation, which is where London pop came in. To craft the look of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Beatles turned to Robert Fraser, the old Etonian art dealer who represented Peter Blake along with a number of important American pop artists. And it was to Blake, along with his American wife, Jan Hayworth, that fell the lion's share of design. Both are seen in this installation shot dressed in white with crossed arms at the center left. Paul McCartney's original notion had been a stiff commemorative portrait of civic worthies from the North, gathered around a band concert in a village green, which was already a kind of Blake tableau in the making. But its realization called upon the complementary background and expertise of Hayworth, who knew how to work at the requisite scale and spatial extension, as she had grown up in Hollywood as the daughter of a successful studio production designer. And she specialized in sculpture that took the shape of large-scale dolls, one of which was included in the final cover tableau, slumped on a chair in the lower right. The spelling out of the album's title, an imitation of decorative civic bedding, represented yet another one of her key contributions. And the photographer Michael Cooper and, sort of general, pop substitute world that came from the Blake Hayworth imagination led to the Pepper Band's imaginary audience. Stockhausen meets Mae West, meets Karl Marx, meets Bob Dylan, meets Sophia Loren, meets Wally Berman, et cetera, was all composed from life-size silhouettes, all 60 of which were arranged around the band, posing in their fancy period uniforms, alongside their younger mop-topped, mod-suited selves in the shape of waxwork effigies on loan from Madame Tussauds. All right, I'm probably just spelling out a whole lot of things that everybody can see and already knows perfectly well. But at a more meta level, what Blake and Hayworth were providing was a disarming frame, a miniaturized substitute for the entire machinery of mass entertainment set in a very English time and place that seemed more agreeably and manageably human-scaled. Much as the formal devices of hippie design had helped render redundant the hard-won originality of new generation sculpture, Here, the fairground and music hall sensibility of earlier pop painting found itself subsumed into a vastly more visible and powerful vehicle as the intricacies of Sgt. Pepper came to supply a key template for the evolving sensibility of the international counterculture. Of course, the album's ingredient of mind expansion lay far more in the sound than in the visual cues of the album sleeve. Yet the fairground visual aesthetic that Boty and, of course, Blake had exemplified actually crossed over from the visual to the musical, spurring some of the trippiest musical moments on the album in the shape of a certain archaic handbill that John Lennon had spotted in a London second-hand shop shortly before the Sgt. Pepper recording began. A place of found fairground pop, a poster from 1843 heralding a performance in Rochdale by the troupe of Pablo Fanky. Now, I wonder, could he have possibly known that Fanky was in fact a really exceptional example of a successful English entertainer who was African in his parentage? It's just a great thing to think about, but we probably have to set it to one side. For the final track on side one of the old vinyl album, being For the Benefit of Mr. Kite, Lennon copied his lyrics almost word for word from the eclectic typography of this antiquated advertising come-on. His copy of the thing having been lost, no other one has ever been found. So the graphic artists credited on the slide are the ones who took the photograph of Lennon with it and reconstructed it as a new letterpress original. But if one was expecting more whimsical nostalgia, the musical translation undercut that expectation. Lennon's chanted verse adaptation of the poster's promised wonders yields to a sonic approximation of Vertigo, composed by producer George Martin from fragmentary sound recordings of steam calliopes, superimposed over a pumping dual organ waltz that he and Lennon played together. In order to achieve the effect they were after, engineer Jeff Emmerich cut the tape into roughly foot-long sections, threw them up in the air, then spliced the pieces into progressively more random sequences. The result, said Martin, was an unreal hodgepodge of sound, arrived at without rhyme or reason, meaningless in musical terms because it was composed of fragments of tunes connected in a series of fractions of a second. Well, I think this is the point where we should remind ourselves what this sounded like. There's more, of course, but I think we better get moving. By recruiting Blake, in particular, Fraser and the Beatles took over the fairground aesthetic of British pop via its best-known exponent, then augmented it with sound and charisma that no artist could hope to match. So that older brand of pop art, Blake's included, found itself as blocked by the counterculture as had new generation sculpture. Sgt. Pepper's Fairground idiom would, of course, have overwhelmed any fragile memory of Pauline Boty's precedence in that regard. But its musical approximations of mind-altering experiences took nothing away from Bridget Riley's public renown. A 1967 magazine poll named her one of the 3 most famous women in Britain after the Queen. But the fact that the other 2 were Mary Quant and Twiggy suggests that the character of her fame had likewise shifted, at least for the moment, into a frame away from Cork Street and the ICA and closer to the Beatles' psychedelia and the King's Road. In multiple ways, the emergence of the counterculture created an impasse for British fine art. But for the young, there was no going directly against it. Finding subsequent ways forward required discovering a counterculture of one's own, one far less subject to the dynamics of sensory, flash, and celebrity. And as it happens, the first crucial steps in this development were taken at the St. Martin's School, pursued in logical increments from the teaching and examples provided by the new generation cohort. The work of Philip King on enveloping shells and upright cones very likely served as one prompt to Barry Flanagan, conceiving in 1965 a series of works in which the plainest sort of flexible container, like an open burlap sack, assumed standing configurations when he filled them with frangible matter like dry plaster or sand. The rough outline of each shape could be anticipated, but its precise configuration, because it was a matter of chance interaction between granular materials and gravity, could not be anticipated, the artist thus stepping back from any over-attentive control. A year later, for a private gallery exhibition in 1966, Flanagan simply scooped and poured sand into a low conical pyramid, which did away with the residue of stability that the filled sack pieces retained. And shortly afterwards, he enlisted a whole gallery as his sculptural envelope by entirely filling it to a certain depth of loose sand. Now, I think for lots of you, such trajectories will seem pretty familiar and unremarkable. Anybody steeped in the received art history of process and site-oriented sculpture of the late 60s, with its stress on basic materials and dull tones undergoing entropic processes like subsiding, settling, propping, seeping, congealing, melting, evaporating, smoldering, and decaying. Well, that's become our received art history of the period. So rapidly did these devices become pervasive across the terrain of advanced art in Europe and America. In fact, that happened so quickly that Flanagan felt moved to produce a photocopied book aimed at documenting British precedents in nearly all such innovations. A case in point, his 1967 one-ton corner preceding Walter de Maria's famous Earth Room and any number of cognate exercises by Richard Serra. McLean was another artist who merited inclusion on any such list. On leaving St. Martin's in 1967, he settled into nearly invisible suburban existence in Barnes, southwest London, partially resurfacing as a teacher at the Croydon School of Art. The work he began making followed a parallel trajectory, hovering at the bare edge of existence as objects susceptible to visual apprehension. Charles Harrison supportively called attention to works that McLean had made in his local vicinity from debris found on various outdoor sites, works then abandoned to happenstance and fate and disintegration. McLean, to use Harrison's words, has set up a series of sculptural situations of determined originality, abandoning any arrangement or process once it begins to lose its particular identity and becomes identifiable as art. That is, it would have identity before it started looking like a work of art, and then it would simply be abandoned to chance and fate. Literally self-liquidating was a 1967 work that McLean called float-away sculpture, which disintegrated at the instance of its instantiation in a moving stream. But survives, said Harrison, quote, as a positive affirmation of the mental reality of sculpture and as a forceful negative as regards its material reality, end quote. Now, for everybody who rightly remembers Harrison as the rigorous voice of the art and language group from the early 1970s onwards, such assessments of 60s British sculpture can come as something of a surprise. That is, his assessments in the moment of late 60s sculpture. In keeping with the priority that Harrison was then placing on the mental rather than the physical persistence of McLean's works in water or mud or pond ice, his analysis of a 68 installation by Richard Long, St. Martin's contemporary of both Flanagan and McLean, offers another window into what posterity has forgotten about the import of such work at the moment of its first creation. The piece in question, installed at the Conrad Fischer Gallery in Dusseldorf, occupied the length of a narrow gallery in which Long laid straight twigs in seemingly parallel lines that actually converged towards the end of the room. Harrison observes that the effect was to make the real length of the gallery impossible to measure. The eye and mind wavered between yielding to the sense of exaggerated distance created by the illusion of perspective and, on the other hand, attempting by process of rational visual calculation to assess the real dimensions of the space, end quote. I hope that Harrison's syntax is precise, and but sometimes it doesn't trip off the tongue or convey itself so easily in verbal terms. But what this double aspect of apperception that he's talking about, suspended between rationally calculable form on one side and involuntary, unruly psychological effects on the other, runs exactly parallel to the double logic of a painting by Bridget Riley, as was explored in the last lecture. It might not seem so because of the much more muted character and natural, unformed materials. But these things lead Harrison to an even more startling claim. Quote, the intuitive realization that sustained illusion, or at least equivocation, acts as a means of undermining the physical and emphasizing the metaphysical. In Long's gallery sculpture, the mind was liberated to enhance the wide-ranging experience for which the gallery was made the equation. Well, the syntax can be complicated, but the connotations of this passage, as far as metaphysical expansion of the mind, are not complicated. Indeed, they reveal how powerfully an alternative, counterculturally inflected idea of art could work even on this astute and highly skeptical observer. Such countercultural inflection lies in multiple aspects of Long's outwardly modest piece, not least in the fact that its materials have no intrinsic value, but speak of an earth that belongs to everyone. They could be thrown into a small suitcase to be reinstalled anywhere, or just discarded with further reiterations of the work being made on the spot from freshly gathered equivalents. Underlying all these traits lay the notion of a nomadic primitive substratum, recoverable from beneath a corrupting modernity. It had almost nothing to do with the Empyrean realm inhabited by the Beatles, and much more to do with the hobo, the thief, the outlaw, and the immigrant, who populate the unadorned visions of Bob Dylan's comeback album, John Wesley Harding, released at the tail end of '67, arising out of Dylan's retreat to rural Woodstock. It was in these years, too, that the Polish stage director and theatrical visionary Jerzy Grotowski emerged as a countercultural legend in a way that seems almost forgotten now. The 1968 translation of his essays and pronouncements, you see the cover here, could be found on the brick and board bookshelves of countless students and young bohemians. Grotowski sought to strip away the machinery of his dramatic medium, but not so much to expose artifice and liberate his audience from mystifying effects in the manner of Brecht. Instead, he was seeking to invest all the instruments of power and all the instruments and power of dramatic illusion into the body of the actor, who could henceforth carry the theater in his person, like a mendicant pilgrim moving from one makeshift shelter to another. The artist guerrilla of this emerging international network would likewise need to travel light and use any material to hand. The critic and himself nomadic curator, Germano Celant, borrowed both Grotowski's term and ethos in gathering a group of Italian artists under the rubric of arte povera. For this group, the naked apprehension of things in themselves, emancipated from conventional protocols of art, stood for knowledge unfiltered and undistorted by authority. As the Parisian uprising of 1968 echoed across Western Europe and back to America, arte povera could present itself as the closest artistic cognate to that spirit. Under this aegis, too, in a break with previous pattern, London artists like Flanagan, McLean, and Long became exports. Long later reflected that after doing his show with Conrad Fischer in Dusseldorf, he began to meet people like Carl Andre and Joseph Beuys and said, "I fell into the international avant-garde and I did feel like I'd come home. I had to leave England to find my peer group, and all my early exhibitions were abroad. When I first showed at the Lisson Gallery in London, it was a strange experience because everyone spoke English." And the international roundup that put the seal on this entire tendency appeared in its first iteration at the 1969 exhibition in Bern, which included this piece by Mario Merz, under the direction of Harald Zeeman, the young curator who chose the title, "Live in Your Head, When Attitudes Become Form, Work, Concepts, Processes, Situations, Information." That run-on string of words demonstrates how much Zeman struggled at the time to put a name to whatever it was that he had assembled, just as historians and critics still struggle to summarize in words a constellation that nonetheless seems so intuitively coherent. In his efforts at description, he first tried out just a string of loosely related terms: the obvious opposition to form, the high degree of personal and emotional engagement, the pronouncement that certain objects are art, although they've not previously been identified as such, the shift of interest away from the result towards the artistic process, the use of mundane materials, the interaction of work and material, Mother Earth as medium, workplace, the desert as concept. And then he just stops in this particular attempt and simplifies, and said that the reader should consider it inevitable that, quote, hippie philosophy, the rockers, and the use of drugs should eventually affect the position of a younger generation of artists, end quote. And that's an excellent question, to which the discipline of art history almost entirely ignores to this day. Speaking in French to his interviewer, he said his desire was to transmit via his exhibition a certain prise de conscience, awakening or coming to awareness that had been born on the American West Coast among hippies, rockers, and drug aficionados, along with Eastern thought and a counterculture. He used the word when it was then actually quite a new coinage. An entire youth movement in need of these new means of expression. Well, so this was far, obviously, from the peacock, splendid boutique variety of countercultural expression that we alluded to earlier and we'll see again in the final lecture, the ones so much more conspicuously associated with hippies and rock stars. But the agrarian offshoots, the communes committed to voluntary poverty and plain self-sufficiency, provided an objective counterpart to the idealized nomad evoked in Grotowski's exalted rhetoric, and a guide as to how visual art could get around the blockade of psychedelic paraphernalia. Intensity of mental transformation, Zeman was arguing, increases as the gap widens between inward vividness and outward modesty of means. The least prepossessing matter could become a fascinating object of visual attention if one could really, really see into that piece of felt or pile of sand or bundle of sticks. Now, Charles Harrison's various remarks, which I quoted earlier, his positing that the physical aspects of art needed to give way to the metaphysical, jibed with Zeman's ideas that unmediated apprehension of matter and its bare contingency left the clearest aesthetic impression on a mental plane of reality. And it was to Harrison that the ICA turned to rejig and rehang Zeman's Live in Your Head when it traveled to London for the third and last stop on its tour. So the transnational network that encompassed New York process artists or Joseph Beuys's shamanistic totems and the unmediated materials of arte povera became a London phenomenon. Indeed, returning in significant respects to one of its strong, if underestimated, points of origin. Harrison had, in fact, little time for Zeman, and by his own account, little contact with him. He collected the crates from the shipping warehouse and he made a show out of them, together with his own considered editions of more British artists. Nor was rocker existence or hippiedom of any evident interest to him. Yet his own introduction to the London version of the catalog sounds notes that make the same utopian points in a less flamboyant, but I think commensurably more intense manner. The effect of work like this, he says, is to stretch the range of our imagination and our conceptions. If we were not generally so terrified of devoting ourselves to what has not already been pronounced serious and socially acceptable, we might respond more easily to questions to which answers might come in a different language, suggesting a different grammar, a different system, a changed consciousness. End quote. The reigning retrospective art histories of this period have, as I've already said, no time for this sort of language, advancing instead the idea that the contributors to Zeman's and Harrison's show, most of them subsequently renowned, would best be placed in an early wave of postmodernism, an assumption that demonstrates little more than what kind of category follows if you never leave the frame of fine art. And art history sadly remains insistently incurious about the frame provided by the 1960s counterculture, which was the most proximate and pertinent phenomenon for these developments in visual art. To be fair, artistic modernism of the new generation could not survive the encounter with the hippie realm, so whatever followed would be in the barest senses postmodernist. But that is thin gruel compared to the vistas that both Zeman and Harrison in their different ways open out to us. And modernism was not, in fact, surpassed, was not post. There were other modernists, as people who were called themselves modernists, if not artists, and they continued to set themselves against the counterculture, and they will be the principal subject in the next and last lecture.